A very warm welcome. You're watching Dream Big. I'm Hannah Viviers. Thank you so much for joining us. Our guest today is William Jimerson. He's the co-founder and the executive director at Musa Capital, which is a private equity company here in Sandton, Johannesburg, South Africa. We're going to be speaking to him about his journey, not only to the business that he started, now bringing funds into helping African businesses grow, but also his personal journey and how he came from the United States to make South Africa his home. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Hannah.
I wanted us to talk a little bit about your business, and I was just talking in the intro, your personal journey to get to where you are now. First of all, I want to start from the end of the story with what you're doing now. Tell us about Musa Capital and what your vision for your business is.
Sure. Musa Capital is a diversified boutique investment bank with two pillars. One that focuses on advisory transactions for emerging opportunities within the African continent, exclusively in Africa. And that includes anything from infrastructure development to financial services to agribusiness, etc. Our clients are typically global corporates looking to do business in Africa, or African institutions themselves looking to do cross-border operations in other African countries, or African governments looking to commercialize a particular sector, privatizing a toll road, capitalizing a local bank, whatever the case may be. The second pillar of the business is private equity. It's the division that I'm responsible for primarily. We invest in mid-sized businesses, and these are companies that may be doing, say in Rand terms, anywhere from 10 million to 100 million Rand in turnover at the time of investment, typically control stakes. But in base level of the economy. So it focuses on things that people need. People need to eat, so we focus on agribusiness and FMCG. People need housing, so housing and construction is one of our areas. And then basic access to financial services, being able to transact. So we have businesses that provide home loans to the base of the pyramid, the lower to moderate income earners, microloans, SME loans, things of that sort. So it's a very baseline business. We don't invest in website hits or the latest, Google architecture, but it is in things that we believe Africa is particularly positioned to offer, either to itself or globally.
I was reading a very interesting article, and it was saying that Africa is reported to have, for the first time this year, 2013, to beat the other BRICS countries as the most attractive investment region. What do you think is happening?
I think the globe is finally waking up to the opportunity, the juggernaut, the darling that the continent is. For so long it's been the stepchild, and largely because it's unknown. If you think about the pillars within the globe of financial capital flocking to the West, and then eventually, I guess in the last decade or so, a lot of focus on the East, China and India, and so now Africa simply is the last frontier. But when people start doing the numbers, a few years ago, McKinsey did a report, and it kind of woke everyone up to things that you and I know, those of us who live here, that it's a tremendous opportunity with, greater than 60 to 70% of the world's natural resources, be it oil, be it minerals of precious stones, be it manufacturing, etc., inputs. It's here, and what's happened traditionally has been pulled out of the ground, exported, value added in Europe or in Asia, and then brought back. And what we're seeing, I think, interestingly enough, it's a lot of the focus initially has been on the consumer in Africa. It's the billion people that are buying all the things made of the goods that were actually sourced here. And so global corporates are starting to realize that the next frontier of growth, I don't know what the numbers are, but the top 6 or 7 out of 20 fastest growing economies are in Africa. So the numbers are just making it up for itself. I think that's what people are paying attention to.
One of the things you were saying to me is that you would really like to see Africa take more of a role into developing our own continent, like you're saying, being able to develop our own products right here.
Look, Africans should invest in Africa under African terms. When you go to China, the Chinese dictate how you invest in China. You go to the U.S., whether it's the SEC or some other local regulatory environment, dictates how you invest in the United States of America. The same in Britain, the same in other emerging economies, Brazil, etc. So now it's time for Africa to determine the basis on how it will interact with the rest of the world, and not just be dictated to or left to be a provider of basic resources.
I was speaking to somebody, though, who was saying that, more research is coming out to say that African governments are beginning to dictate more of what's going on, whether the money is coming from China or from anywhere else in the world. They're beginning to say, well, we welcome your money, we welcome the investment, but these are the terms under which it's going to work.
No, it's happening. It's controversial because, look, if I'm an outsider, then that's the last thing I want, is you dictate to me how I'm going to do business in your country. Because it's not economically to my benefit. I want to do it under my terms, and unfortunately, I suppose human nature is to exploit the opportunities. Capitalism. That's what happens. Buy at the lowest price, sell at the highest price. So it makes it better for me to buy the gold from you in Zimbabwe at the lowest possible price, and then sell it back to you as a ornament or a chain or a wedding ring, or the case may be, at the highest price. And so, you see policies like in Zimbabwe, or even here in South Africa, from an empowerment perspective, that are dictating now how global corporates do business. Not always popular, but ultimately the right thing in the long term.
Something that seems to be almost always synonymous when you talk about African investment, it's synonymous to that when you hear people talking about it, is risk. So let's just talk a bit about that, because before it seemed as though that risk would be a point of aversion for investors to say, well, we're going to look somewhere else. But now, if we're talking about Africa, and these reports saying that people are looking at Africa, investors are looking at Africa and saying, well, it's probably right now they're choosing it over Brazil, they're choosing it over the other BRICS countries. What's happened to make the risk factor, a factor, but they still want to come here?
It's perception. Risk is probably 90% perception. It's the fear of the unknown, right? And one of the challenges the continent has always had, still does, relative to the rest of the world, is lack of data. And so an analyst can sit at his desk in New York and determine the key risk measurements in Brazil, because he can read a report or go into an online database that someone is doing the research and compiling, and allows them to do the analysis. For so long, you just couldn't do that in Africa. I remember one of our first investments in telecommunications in the mid-90s. We went to Senegal and asked for a database of the users, the number of subscribers that were currently on the wireline telephone network, and some other technical data. And our host from the investment authority there gave us a phone book. You can't make this stuff up. It sounds like I am, but you can't, right? Because just the concept of providing data, for him, the data was people's phone numbers, right? So where now Senegal happens to be one of the most advanced digital technologies on the continent, digital platforms on the continent. So we're seeing the advent of 4G technology and LTE technology here in South Africa. So what is changing is the barriers to collecting and providing data, so that people on the outside can do that analysis. It makes it a lot more tenable. That's one. And two, it's the practicality of it. You look at companies like Walmart, which is the largest retailer, one of the largest retailers on the planet. They've gone everywhere else. There is no place else to go. Now, with the capitalization, I don't know, $40 billion US or whatever Walmart is, you would say to yourself, well, why would Walmart come and pay a premium in some people's eyes for a publicly traded mass retailer here, Massmart, in South Africa, whose market cap or sales make up less than a percentage of that of Walmart? Why does that even make sense? Why would they even bother themselves in doing that? The reason is because Africa has 1 billion people that can buy stuff, and South Africa has a lower risk profile perception. Why? Because the availability of data, the efficiency of the capital markets here, the existence of local banks, etc. And so it's the perception that there's less risk here. But those of us here on the ground may argue differently, with be it labor challenges, be it the power supply issue. There are a lot more challenges, arguably real risk, in South Africa than they are in some other emerging economies on the continent. But Walmart came here first because the perception and the transparency, what South Africa's done a great job in, is not just compiling data, but sharing it and being transparent and reaching out to the world and inviting the rest of the world in.
Are other countries doing that better now when it comes to that perception?
Better than when we started in '95, but still not good enough. Some of it is just lack of resources. You take a place like South Sudan, which is one of our clients. There's opportunity there for everything, right? Whether it's, you can't get a working telephone line out of South Sudan during the middle of the day. It's just, you can't. The lines are congested. Sending a fax is a problem, right? Going to a local ATM. A lot of the things that we take for granted here that just work because they do, it's not there. Why? Because the country's been at war for the last 20 plus odd years. So now there's a tremendous opportunity, and with all that oil in the ground, there's the perception and obviously the opportunity to be able to afford some of the consumer and manufacturing opportunities that are there. But the world hasn't rushed in as quickly as one would think, into that situation, in part because the government there is really trying to focus on the basics. And so, organizing trade missions and sending, ministers and other government representatives out to other marketplaces and interfacing, because New York is not coming to South Sudan. London is not coming to South Sudan.
But what makes, we've seen countries like China go into environments like that. You're talking about South Sudan being a client of yours. And I also want to talk about Zimbabwe a little bit later. These are countries that are seen to have huge risk profiles. What makes you want to go into those environments?
Well, the similar drive, right? We chose to be a firm exclusively focused on Africa. So, if African risk were an issue for me, I'd be out of business. We've had the blessing of going into places like Nigeria in the late 90s and, doing very well, despite the perception of the risk that was there back then. In 2002, 2004, MTN went in and paid $250 million US for a license. Every analyst thought they were crazy, right? Stock took a hit, and now it's one of the fastest growing markets on the planet. And it makes up, 50, 60% of MTN's market cap. So what makes us go in is the same thing that other local corporates have seen doing business, same thing that Walmart saw, is the opportunity. For us, there's opportunity in chaos.
One of the things that I heard Dr. Nkosana Moyo speak, and this was at a conference where Musa had been a part of, and he was quoting Musa having said something about supply, and that we do have these over 1 billion consumers that you talk about, but sometimes we don't have the products or the services. The money is there, the consumers have the money, but they don't have the products that they would like to purchase. Just talk to us a little bit about how you see that changing.
Yeah, well, look, that's, again, our thesis back in the 90s, the three founders of the firm, all engineers by training, and so we like technical stuff. And so telecom was one of the areas that we chose to focus on early. And when I left Merrill Lynch, I left Wall Street to pursue building a telecom business in the U.S. And at the time, early 90s, the United States was encouraging, from the U.S. perspective, minorities, African Americans and other underrepresented minorities to participate in telecom. And so they opened up this new opportunity and started licensing new issuance, new licenses to enter the mobile market. In that market, you were going into a situation where you had some of the world's largest telephone companies, AT&T, MCI still existed back then, 9X, which is now Verizon, Bell Atlantic, etc. And so the opportunity to go into that auction, to go and then pay for a license, to then go and buy the same equipment that your competitors are already deploying, to go and be the 5th competitor in a market. In a market, by the way, that at the time had a 99% telephone penetration, meaning 99 out of every 100 people owned a telephone at the time, and more often more than one. As compared to South Africa, forget the rest of the continent. A 5%, 7% telephone penetration. The entire continent of Africa had a 2% telephone penetration. Every 2 out of 100 people had access to telephone services. So here's a market with 99 out of 100. Here's a market with 2 out of 100. Our estimates thought that 2 would triple, right, to 6, which we'd have made a ton of money doing that. Now telephone penetration in Africa stands at like 70%, right? So you talk about supply and demand, it's basic things. People don't have access to basic things. Back in the 90s, they didn't have access to basic telephony services. And with the advent of technology and innovation, we could leapfrog some of the process that happened in the States.
But I think this goes back to what you were saying of just being able to provide those basics is such a huge opportunity in terms of business.
It's huge. You know, we're invested in a group that builds and manages Spar grocery stores here in the country. And their strategy is exclusively rural areas. So they don't want to compete in the Santon CBDs or Pretorias, etc. Their belief is, and their philosophy is, that the consumer in those markets, which is a lower income consumer, right? They're working in a mining town, or in a town that does tree felling or whatever the case may be, or coal, what have you, that the consumer there is being ignored. They're being underrepresented, they're being underserved with the quality and the quantity of the things that are available. So the group bought a store, was maybe, 20 years old, doing about 3.5 million rand a month in turnover. Revamped it, threw in almost double the size of the store, more than double the size of the store, put in the food lovers market, so there's fresh food and potatoes and onions and just, a proper shopping experience like you would have in a Santon, right? Now, again, some of the folks within the group within Spar thought they're crazy for doing that. No one does that. No one puts 3 million rand into a store that's turning 3 million rand a month. Why would you do that? In a rural area? Like, those people can't afford that stuff. That store today is doing 10 million rand in turnover, right? And can't keep the shelves stocked enough with the supplies that are there. We didn't make this up here at Musa, right? But it's a global phenomenon that people, as we move up the social economic ladder, we want more stuff, right? Magic Johnson in the States, when he left playing U.S. basketball, I'm a basketball fan, that's why I use Magic as an example. He built his business exclusively in minority neighborhoods, right? He went to Brooklyn, he went to Harlem, and he put in the highest end, nicest movie theater and shopping experience you could find. Now, before that, people in Harlem would train it down to Midtown to buy the same level of things that the Wall Street banker was getting. But now they could stay at home and do it. One of the fastest growing grocery stores, fastest growing movie chains in the entire country at the time that he did it, right? So Africa, and this to be clear though, Africa is not just about the consumer story, about buying things. It's also true on the other end of the spectrum, the things that we can make, right? So,
and I want to talk about, when you talk about things that we can make, because one of the things that we see sometimes is our GDP is being revised dependent on our resources. So, for instance, if the gold price goes up and now the economy is making more money. In Nigeria, the oil price goes up, now the economy is making more money. But then when it comes to us actually making things and producing things that are outside of just taking things out of the ground, it seems as though that's a place that we need to probably develop a bit more.
We have to, right? And it has to be in strategic resources. If you own it, if it sits in the ground only here, God bless the planet in various ways. But here on the continent, we're blessed with a tremendous amount of resources. No matter how much the guys in the States or Europe or the East want it, they've got to come to you. So come on your own terms. And instead of selling cocoa at, $1,000 a ton, put in a manufacturing facility, process it. You don't have to make chocolate. You could make paste and butter, right? Two of the inputs to the next processing in confection. which changes it being from $1,000 a ton off the tree, I should say, to being $10,000 a ton.
But I have been asking this question, and I think lots of Africans have been asking this question for decades. Why don't we do that?
The answer to that unanswerable question. A lot of challenges that remain here, right? In many places, we don't believe that we can do it. As Africans, we don't. That's my personal critique, because for so long you haven't, right? For so long there's been a culture of someone else will come and do this for us, or we're only good enough to do so much. But put aside where that mentality came from, now they are educated Africans globally, not just here on the continent, but in the States, in Europe, etc. And that expertise is coming back home. I was listening to a radio announcement this morning. They were talking about a radio show. They were talking about Ghana and how it's one of the fastest growing economies in Africa, etc. And how Ghanaians, who, some had migrated here, are not going back to Ghana. Some that had migrated to the States are not going back home, because we're starting to believe in ourselves. Now, the reason Ghana, interestingly enough, is growing as fast as it is because they discovered oil. Right? Again, they're pulling stuff out of the ground. But Ghana has a unique position that only a few other African countries have, which is a very educated population. And whether that's in the diaspora or they're at home, extremely educated. And so they see the opportunity. And they will take advantage of it, because the companies that are pulling oil out of the ground, they need to feed their employees. Their employees need access to basic financial services. They want to buy houses, right? There needs to be roads built and so forth and so on. And so it's happening. And I think I'm the first to have a cigar and a scotch and talk about all the challenges that Africa has, but also I am the first to say, give us time. Let's be patient.
One of the things that we have in Africa that we don't talk about enough, I think, is just human resource. When we think of how many young, able people we have I was listening to the Prime Minister of Singapore in an interview, just talking about that being one of the biggest challenges his country faces, of this aging population. And here we have so many young, energetic people that would be able to take the reins. And it seems as though we're not using that particular resource as well as we should be.
Got to educate them. Got to educate them. That 18-year-old kid can either be an engineer, a scientist, a mathematician, an accountant, a welder, whatever, a farmer, or he can be suspect number 10. And the difference between those two young men is education. Right? We don't want to live lives on handouts. We don't want to live lives on welfare or social grants or theft. It's not who we are as Africans. We resort to that when we feel we don't have any other options.
I want to talk about this because education, from the conversations you and I have had, it seems as though it's something that you're very passionate about. Living in South Africa, and you've seen it from the work end. We talk about it, so much when it comes to where the education in South Africa is. And you've seen it from a work perspective of the effects and the results of that, of having a defunct education system. I would like you to speak to us a little bit about the experience that you've had.
It's been eye-opening. When we started the firm, we obviously being based in the States, traveling over to Africa, we hired Americans, guys I went to school with, and these are guys from Harvard, MIT, Boston University, whatever the case may be, and not a problem at all even to find people of African descent, African Americans, that had the skills and capabilities to do the job. Never even a thought as a risk issue for us. In 2004, we decided to take the approach that, if you're going to invest and build Africa, you need to be in Africa. So we pulled up roots and planted down here. And we began to learn and to appreciate something that we didn't understand 9 or 10 years before, the challenge of human resources that sits here. Often in either African studies lecture, or reading a news article, being in the States, I heard about apartheid, and people would talk about, I'd read about the effects. Living it here, where my counterpart, me here, a 43-year-old man here, would have 99.9% less likelihood to be sitting in the seat. Right? It's just, I'm an anomaly a bit in the States, a bit. You can toss a coin, and as an African American male born in 1970, I had 50% chance of going to MIT, which I did, or ending up in the penal system, which I've always thought that was terrible, right? Like we're dying in the States, but here it's got to be 80%, 90%. So as we've recruited over the years, and as we've grown, we went from 7 professionals in the States to 25, 30 here now, and doing it here, sourcing locally. And there's Kenyans and Zambians and Zimbabweans and Cameroonians, but a lot of South Africans, because obviously we're based in South Africa. The skill level of previously disadvantaged South Africans, and I'm not talking about the skill level broadly. I'm not going to townships and recruiting people who haven't gotten matrics or don't have university degrees. I'm talking about university graduates. The skill levels that they come into these situations with, it's an atrocity, is the short. In part for 2 reasons. One, I see the effect of reducing your matric pass rate down to 40% or whatever it is now. So if you're just pushing people through the system in order to pass them, when they get to a point where they have to actually perform, they don't have a clue. It's not because of lack of passion or focus or energy or spending the hours, etc. They just don't have the skills. Full stop. And so, we found ourselves having to retrofit. If we hired someone, particularly at a junior level, when you're hiring someone that's 5, 10 years, of experience, you're getting the cream of the crop. There's very few of them, right? And as a small firm, I'm competing against Investec or Braid or Ethos, et cetera, to get these candidates in. And so we don't need a lot of them. So our philosophy was we'll cream them as they come available. But in part because of our passion, have an impact. And in part because of practicality, we're growing. And so inevitably, I need to be able to extend my base of potential candidates. And so I need to hire younger guys and gals coming out of school. And when you go down to folks coming out of 1, 2 years of experience, or they're coming out of university, they just simply don't have the skills, full stop. And so you got a choice. Either you don't hire them, or you've got to retrofit your environment to accommodate that. And so we've hired a lecturer from UJ to come in and teach accounting, right, in a 8-week program to do what should have happened in school 6 years ago. We have a firm that comes in that teaches Excel and basic computer skills, right? That teaches how to use PowerPoint and Word and so forth. And so
these are people that have graduated.
These are graduates with degrees that have been working, right? Some working in government, some working in some of the corporates, and you find the experience is that they've been hired, they're regulated to some mundane task, and they never get the exposure. And you could blame that on an impartial environment, right, where selection is happening. But you can also get a practical reality, right? I don't care what color skin you are. If you can't do the job, you can't do the assignment. And I'm a senior banker at Standard Bank. I'll pick on Standard because they help us out a lot. And the guy can't do the job, then I'm gonna go to the next guy, right? So these institutions aren't really designed to work with someone who comes in with a handicap, essentially. And it's what it is. It's a handicap. but it's not an insurmountable one.
When you talk about it not being insurmountable, though, and you're talking about all these opportunities here in South Africa in particular, what then? What do you do when you talk about it being possible for us to fix it from a business point of view, and you're talking about the end result of it? Where do we even begin?
Well, look, I think the beauty of the continent, and if our perspective is a Pan-African perspective, but we're physically here in South Africa, and this is our base for a lot of reasons. And one of the things that I will applaud the government for having some vision on is recognizing that the diaspora can help fill the gap in the meantime, right? That whether it's African Americans or Nigerians or Zambians or Zimbabweans, I mean, hell, I think half of the graduating classes in Zimbabwe are here, right? And some of the strongest candidates, black, white, green, or purple, are Zimbabweans. They're just trained well, right? Why? Because the country invested in education. Simple. And so, in the meantime, while South Africa is getting it right, which they are, they're investing, but it takes time, right? You've got generations that have to be, there'll have to be a interim intervention to address the existing generational challenges. But, hopefully, I don't know, the guys who are 5, 8, 10 years old now that are...
But that's only if it gets better, though.
If it's getting better. It's getting better. Is it getting better fast enough? Probably not. But it is getting better. I would hazard to say, and I don't have empirical data to back this up, but as a 5-year-old South African now, from a previously disadvantaged background, you have a better shot today than you did 10 years ago. And you'll have a better shot tomorrow than you do today.
I want to talk about, I was watching an interview that you had done, and you were talking about the first pitch that you did when you wanted to set up shop here and start off Musa here. What did you say that made that pitch successful?
A lot of prayers, first and foremost. We were still young and dumb, and so, but hungry, and so at every opportunity to tell the Africa story and how we believed that at the time, it was mostly on telecom, how 2% could go to 6%, and how people would definitely, if we provided it, we built it, that people would, they would take it up.
Was this back in 95?
It's 95. So we'd had the fortune of an African believing in Africans, Zimbabwean, as a matter of fact, Shingai Mutasa. And Shingai, he seeded us, not enough to go and make an investment, but at least enough to go and raise additional funding, set up offices, and so forth. And so I was at his house in Harare, and he had some relatives over and friends, and just chatting about U.S. football to one of the guys there, and when I found out he was from the States or whatever. So, and he asked me to kind of tell him about what I was doing in Africa. And so, you give me that platform, I'm gonna pitch you, right? And so I did. And at the end of it, he said, you should come and meet my principal. He's looking at doing some things in Africa. It could be interesting. So, fine. I have passport. We'll travel. Little to know that I found out before the trip, which was the meeting was in Dallas, at a hangar, which was reserved for retrofitting his 747 for his private use. It's Prince Al Walid of Saudi Arabia and Kingdom Holdings, and so the Prince was known at the time primarily for his investment in Citibank. Subsequent to that, he's been in Apple and Motorola, and so he's I think top 3 richest men on the planet from Fortune. This is kind of circa mid-90s or so. And so when we got there, we walked into the main conference area, and there had to be at least 75 people.
Now, I just want to ask you this. You're walking in, and I'm sure you'd pitched before, but are you nervous at all?
No, look, I'd had the blessing of an excellent training, at Merrill Lynch, and doing M&A and corporate finance there. So I cut my teeth pitching, right? And by this time I had already, started 2 businesses, and though they both failed, I've pitched before. I've raised money. I've raised $10,000. For myself, I've raised $250,000 for myself. I'd gone on road shows raising, $1 billion for Walt Disney. And so I'd taken a drilling company public. So I've been taught how to pitch, right? But I've been used to talking to corporates, guys in, little tight blue suits and red ties, where the case may be. Not royalty. It was a different thing. And it was the pomp and circumstance of it all. The billionaire in the U.S., in New York, you can have a billionaire right next to you on the train in the morning, right? Like, people don't wear it, right? The prince, he's a prince, so he wears it. Right? So, with an entourage of no less than 75 people, there's a camera team there that's following him. Why? Because he owns a TV station, so they air his meetings, right? Business Week is doing a documentary on him and writing a book. So, like, one of the writers or whatever is shadowing him there. You had the head of Middle East for Citibank, who just hangs out with him because he just wants his banker available. And the head of Middle East for Arthur Andersen, it still existed back then. That was before the Enron scandal and all that. So there's a lot of stuff going on around the prince at all times.
And were you having to talk and pitch in front of all these people?
So we walked through a corridor where it's literally, and there's armed guards and guys with the little bugs in the ears or whatnot, walking down the corridor, and we open up into the room, and immediately the camera lights, hit us in the face. It's like walking out into a game show or something. It was extremely dramatic, because we're not prepped for that, right? We're not prepped for that. So the cameras are there, and so you people in the sea is kind of surreal describing it, but the sea of people open up, and it's a little like, I don't know, the princess, maybe he's 5'5". I mean, he's a really small guy, right? So this little guy with this little turban on and so forth at the head of the table, and he moves at 1,000 miles an hour. So everything he does, including handshakes, etc., is fast. Makes very little eye contact with you, and he wants to go because he's doing stuff 20 hours a day, right? The documentary on him that came out later talked about how he would, he gets up at, he goes to sleep does a siesta at like 6 in the afternoon, he gets up at 10 in the evening, and he works to 4 o'clock in the morning. He really does that. They didn't just make that up, right? So many of those times I was with him in Riyadh working at the time in the morning. So yeah, so we're sitting down trying to get, you freeze out everything. I guess being having the blessing of growing up being an athlete and playing sports and so forth, you drown out the crowd noise. Now, never had a stage quite like that before, but and we get into doing what we do, and halfway through it, he just interrupts us. He closes the pitch book and says, "You know what? I'll do it."
I want to know what you said. Well, what did you say to this man?
Look, it's opportunity, Your Highness, because you have to address him as such. It's opportunity, right? You saw it in the Middle East. You saw it in Saudi Arabia. You built a bank based upon opportunity. You built a media empire based on opportunity. You invested in Citibank based on opportunity. You invested Citibank, it's almost bankrupt. This is not the last time, back in the late 90s. Your counterparts thought you were crazy for doing it, right? Why would you put money in a failing U.S. bank? And now you're the largest shareholder, and you've got a 10 times multiple on your money. Go where the opportunity is. It's not in Europe. It's not in the East. It's not in the States. It's in Africa. Why? Because no one else is there, right? Imagine the opportunity you'll have being the largest pot of money going into any of these economies. You add that to your royalty, right? And the reality of the affinity that should be there. And he coined a phase, the south-to-south connection, right? So everything kind of below the equator, right? That we'll come in as partners as opposed to aggressors. It made sense to him, right? Because it mirrored and paralleled his philosophy. He doesn't want to overpay for anything. He went into Apple. Apple was at, I don't know, split adjusted $10 a share, right? This is.
Was there ever such a time? I think some people may question.
Apple almost died. Remember, Steve Jobs, he left and came back because it was dying. He came into Apple then. Now he made some bad bets. He invested in Motorola as well and a few other things, but he buys value, and that's the play. Africa is a value play, right? There's a tremendous amount of supply, not a lot of demand, right? We said to him, we did an analysis on his portfolio. We said, look, even when you went into the publicly listed stocks that you've invested in, your average entry multiple, like the price earnings multiple these stocks are trading at, was 9 or 10, right? So you're paying $10 for every $1 that the company earned last year. In Africa, if we pay more than 4, it's an extremely special opportunity. Right? So believe in the opportunity.
Now, I wanted to start at the end because I wanted to first talk about all your achievements. We haven't spoken about all your achievements, but most of what you've done. And you had mentioned about your profile, who you are, your race, and all of that in the States when it comes to success. So now we can go to the beginning, and I'd like you to talk about what you've achieved right now compared to how your life started out and where it started out.
2617 15th Street, Meridian, Mississippi. That's my first address. It's where I came home from, the state hospital in Mississippi. Born to a single mother who was still in college at the time. She was 20 when she had me, and she went back to school, and I went to live with my grandparents. 4th and 6th grade educations between the two of them. A military career for my grandfather. But despite those, strong emphasis on education, on spiritual grounding and education. And, of the places on the planet to be born and to be African American, Mississippi was one of the worst. I would argue today probably still one of the worst, because it's last in everything. It's last ranked in education. It's last ranked in opportunities for white, black, green, or purple. It didn't matter. Last in manufacturing, last in GDP. It's just last. It's just used to being last. So a very unlikely outcome has been my journey. And I owe that to having a lot of God-fearing people around me. My family, some extended family, my godfather, that just believed at every step. And, you asked earlier the question of why, as Africans, we haven't taken advantage. Why I'm here is because I believe. There's never been a point in my life that I didn't believe. Not because of my own capability, but because of the capability of those around me, right? I was just taught to believe that it can be done. And so I remember my grandmother would walk me to preschool. And then when I was 7, 8 years old, she walked me to the extracurricular activities after school. It's a computer lab. So this is, 76, 77, TRS 80s, right? Texas Instrument computers. It was, back in the day when you turn the computer on, the little green light flashes or whatever. What's extraordinary for me is, unfortunately, I wasn't able to ask her before she passed away, like, what dawned upon you to even think about taking me there, right? Like, first of all, how did you find it in Mississippi? And why would you take me there? Right? I hadn't shown any particular aptitude, in computers or anything. I was 8. But she did, and that exposure to opportunity, it just continued. And at every turn, though I didn't always excel the way that I should have, with the opportunity, I maybe just did enough that someone else took notice, and they presented me a new opportunity. By the time I went to live with my mother, she was finishing grad school. And so somehow between a 4th and 6th grade education, my grandparents produced a lieutenant colonel, a head nurse in a military hospital, and a corporate executive, my mom. And so with 3 women of excellence in the family, all university degrees, masters, and so forth, there was already a culture of education that formed the base of who we were. And so it was only natural that my mom picked up where my grandmother left off and just made sure that I had every opportunity to excel. Right now, I moved from Mississippi to Georgia. So right after being last, you're just first from last, or maybe second from last. Alabama maybe is first from last. So, in the South, in the United States, is not a good place to be as an African American, particularly in the 70s or 80s. But, my mom found the little pockets of opportunity for me to excel. By the time I got to high school, and it's funny, I just went back from my 25th year high school reunion, my wife and I, a few weekends ago. And the high school that I went to was a science and math academy. Right? It was built maybe 4 or 5 years before that with the specialty of catering to...
And it wasn't a private school?
It wasn't a private, it's a public school. It's a public school, but a public school, they refer to them as magnet schools. And so, if you similar to here, so if you live in the area, you can go to the school.
But you have to have a certain, I would imagine, aptitude to be there.
Well, so because it's a public school, if you live in the area, you can go there. All right? But to get into the magnet school, to the Science and Math Academy part of it, you had to take a test and go through interviews, etc. But if you did that, you could live outside of the area. So we lived between trains and buses and walking a 2.5-hour commute from the school. It's a 45-minute drive. So I wouldn't have qualified to go to that school otherwise. But based on the preparation I had before, God willing, I passed the test and I got in. And my mom, for the first 2 years, she commuted an hour out of her way for work to ensure that I went to that school. And then once I got at a point where, I could do it on my own, I did a 2.5-hour train and walking commute and bus to go to school. And then at that school, there were teachers who just inspired me, right, and pushed for every opportunity, whether it was doing science projects, whether it was competing in math club and chemistry club. We had, by the time I was 15, I had traveled to the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West Coast in science fairs. Now, funny enough, at the time I was doing it because if you won at the science fair, you won prizes. So there's computers and cash and so forth. So for me, it was an opportunity to make some money. Right?
Not knowing that this was foundation.
The foundation, right? Because the exposure, being in that environment, competing, and believing again, right? I, one of the programs I competed in, I found some buddy of mine sent me a video from this. This is circa 86, 87, right? That, and I'll send it to you. It's classic. So I'm in a gray suit. I don't know where I got it because it's a gray, like, reflective, high shine suit, right? But being interviewed with 3 of my other classmates by executives from a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, and DEC was eventually bought by Compaq, bought by HP. So, but anyway, interviewed by them about our competition, where I'd won in oratory, in math, and in science, right? In 3 areas, and that afforded me not only a computer and cash prizes, etc., an internship to work at this company as a high schooler, right? And eventually, it led to a full scholarship to MIT. Right? Why? Just because someone made something available for me. So, my philosophy on life has been, no matter where you're from, whether it's, as Malcolm X used to say, if you know Meridian, Mississippi, you know Soweto, right? It's the same. And no matter where you're from, if you're prepared, you will get the opportunity. You're going to get your shot. The question is, are you going to have the preparation to take advantage of it?
I want to talk a little bit now as we close and we wrap up. You're growing up, you're being exposed to all of these things, and you say to me you would watch TV and see things about Africa, and what you'd learned in school was mostly it pretty much started and ended about the whole slave trade and Africans going to the States, and there wasn't much being taught about what was going on in Africa, history, other things that make Africa Africa, not just about African Americans coming from here as slaves. And you see, you'd watch TV and look at it and say, there are people that look like me. What are the kind of questions that would be going through your head as you would wonder, because it seems as though you were curious and thinking about all these things. What are the kind of questions you'd ask yourself about Africa?
I tuned my awakening about Africa to one of my favorite movies. I'm a science geek, so The Matrix is one of my favorite movies. And so, similar to the character in The Matrix, Neo, played by Keanu Reeves, he just feels that something isn't right? That he's going through life and things are happening around him, but it just seems out of place. There has to be something more. So, in high school, at this Math and Science Academy, we were ranked the top public high school in the United States for 3 years running, right? So this is not a back order type. This is premier, right, of African American, all African American school. Our social studies of Africa was the equivalent in the 8th grade. It was equivalent of creating a little map of Africa and pasting onto the map the resources: coffee beans, sugar, right? Some black stuff for oil, sprinkles for gold. So we identified with Africa based upon the natural resource. Nothing about the people. Nothing about Timbuktu. Nothing about the pyramids. Nothing about Walter Sisulu. Nothing about the struggle. Nothing. Just what the resources were. That was our indoctrination. Something seemed right about that to me. There had to be more. When I got to MIT, this is after I'd done prep school at Andover, and so I've been exposed to Africans at this point. In Atlanta, you weren't exposed to any Africans, but the time I got to the Northeast, going to Andover, going to MIT, there was an African Students Association on MIT's campus. Ghanaians and some South Africans even, etc. But then there was a Black Students Association, African Americans. The Black Students Association didn't do anything with the African Students Association. Put aside why there had to be two different associations. They didn't work together, didn't talk to each other, didn't do anything together. But there happened to be a young man who was the kind of the dorm counselor who was from Ghana, Maui. And I chat to Maui from time to time, and it dawned upon me, we've got a lot in common. We don't ever talk to each other. Something doesn't seem right about that. My senior year at MIT, I sat in a lecture at the Sloan School, the business school there, on doing business in Africa. And they brought a few companies in to talk about doing business in Africa. And it was the first time that I identified with my other co-African, Pan-Africanist, Antoine, my partner. He was in the lecture at the same time. He went to BU. And we both asked questions about the opportunity. And the answers, however, didn't seem complete. So for my entire career, until I set foot off the plane in Kampala, in Uganda, which was my first trip in '95, and I began to live it myself, until I sat at that table for breakfast at the Mikos Hotel in Zim, till I came here, stayed at the Carlton downtown, hung out at a Shabin till 3 o'clock in the morning in Yeovil, until I started spending time with Africans and understanding we are the same. When I was at MIT, the competition to survive there is tremendous. It's full of valedictorians and people on honors and all that. It's built, though, to not survive on your own. If you try to go through MIT on your own, you will fail. There are plenty of high suicide rates, kids that with straight A averages coming out of high school, perfect scores out of SAT, jumping off buildings because they try to do it by themselves. It's a collaborative environment. They promote that, all right? So here's an environment where we're, 10% of the population. But I focused on the Asian students, the Chinese students particularly. always successful, always at the top of the class. Why? They always worked together. It didn't matter if they were from China or they were from America, they always worked together. And so what brought me to Africa was an opportunity to work together. They're not just 40 million African Americans in the state. There's 1 billion Africans. And if we work together, two heads are better than one.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, I have to ask you if there's anything that, it's very evident to see what your life's about, what your passion is, but on our program, Dream Big, it's about dreaming big. It's about going after what you're passionate about and making things happen. The people that are watching this, what's the one thing that you would like to share with them?
All things are achievable. Not necessarily within yourself, but with God as your base. He'll never fail you. You will suffer. You will come into situations where you find failure in that situation. He's preparing you for something better. Don't lean upon your own understanding. Trust in Him.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was absolutely fantastic speaking to you. And
I like talking.
There's so many things that you've said, and as you're talking, I'm thinking of all the other discussions, because we have to bring you back on the program. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.